It's always a great pleasure for me to introduce my colleague, Aaron Turner, who is a fellow and assistant director of the Knapp Foundation and a research associate at Royal Holloway, University of London. Aaron's primary research interest is the relationship between the philosophy of history and the history of philosophy from antiquity to modernity. There's a Kehrer, if ever there was one. He is the editor of a number of volumes, including Heidegger and Classical Thought, published by SUNY in 2024, and the Essence of History, which will be published by Routledge this year. And he is currently working on his monograph, Thucydides and the Ground of History. And he has forgotten to include for me the name of his title, which is Der Abbruch des Philosophierens, Heidegger's Turn to Ground. Aaron, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. At the beginning of his 1932 lecture course on Anaximander and Parmenides, Heidegger posed the fundamental question: our task, der Abbruch des Philosophierens, the cessation of philosophizing, that is, the end of metaphysics, from out of an originary question according to the meaning of truth. According to the meaning, truth in parentheses, Wahrheit in parentheses, of being with a Y, das Ende der Metaphysik aus ursprünglichem Fragen nach dem Sinn, Wahrheit des Seins. Heidegger proceeds to embark upon a radical new interpretation of both Anaximander and Parmenides that provides the impetus for a decisive new engagement with early Greek thought over the next decade. And at the same time, it lays the groundwork for a decisive new engagement with the history of metaphysical thought, with the history of being itself. For Heidegger, the possibility of the end of philosophy was entirely grounded in understanding not simply its beginning, but its inception, its Anfang, the inception of Western thought and its arrival with the Greeks. 10 years earlier, in a lecture course given in 1921-22, Heidegger had located the real inception, echte Anfang, of philosophy in Cartesian skepticism. Das eigentliche Fundament der Philosophie, the true foundation of philosophy, is the radical existential grasp of and the maturation of Fraglichkeit, of questionableness, to pose in questionableness oneself and life and its decisive actions is the fundamental stance of all, including the most radical elucidation. Skepticism, so understood, is the inception of philosophy, and as the genuine inception, it is also the end of philosophy, das Ende der Philosophie. That's GA 61. Between 1922 and 1932, Heidegger came to increasingly recognize the importance of locating the inception of philosophy in early Greek thought, in order to bring about the end of metaphysics and to establish a new or other Anfang. It could well be assumed that prior to 1932, Heidegger had simply not identified the real significance of Parmenides in both the history of philosophy and in his own thinking. Indeed, in a letter to Elizabeth Blockman written in December 1932, he remarks, "The more vigorously I get into my own work, the more securely I find myself compelled each time back to the great inception of the Greeks. And often I waver as to whether it isn't more important to abandon my own endeavors and work only to ensure that this world is brought to stand before our eyes in its stirring greatness and exemplary character, rather than being merely adopted." In a letter to Karl Jaspers, written only 2 weeks earlier, Heidegger similarly remarks that he has devoted the last year entirely to the Greeks, and even in this sabbatical semester, they aren't letting me go. We know, though, especially in the context of Lawrence's paper earlier, that Parmenides had assumed an important position for Heidegger from very early on. In 1913, at just 24, Heidegger had claimed Parmenides and Heraclitus cannot die. 2 years later, in 1915, the first course he taught at Freiburg was on the subject of the history of ancient philosophy, which, according to Bill Richardson, was titled Über Vorsocratica Parmenides. While Heidegger's treatment of Parmenides in his 1926 lecture course, Die Grundbegriffe der antiken Philosophie, GA 22, is relatively rudimentary and leans heavily on the work of Karl Reinhardt, a year earlier in his lectures on Plato's Sophist, Heidegger refers to the word noein, which he says appears immediately at the decisive beginning of Greek philosophy, where the fate of Greek and Western philosophy is determined by Parmenides. But he does not expand on this point. Parmenides features more frequently in Sein und Zeit, And it is here that Heidegger begins to develop a more original interpretation when he says that Aristotle's principle of being refers back to the ontological thesis of Parmenides. And yet Parmenides is conspicuously absent from Heidegger's major writings between 1927 and 1932. His name does not occur once in the Kant book of 1929, nor in Heidegger's lectures on Die Grundbegriff der Metaphysik. In the first edition of his 1929 essay, Vom Wesen des Grunds, Parmenides is mentioned briefly, while later in the essay, Heidegger points to the significance of early Greek thought when he says in a discussion of Welt, already in the decisive inception of ancient philosophy, something essential is revealed. The exact wording, entscheidenden Anfängen, is repeated in a short discussion of Parmenides in the context of the distinction of das Sein and das Seiende in Heidegger's 1931 lectures on Aristotle's metaphysics. How then was Heidegger beginning to think through the decisive inception of Western thought in the period of between the publication of Sein and Zeit in 1927 and the delivery of the Parmenides lecture in 1932? And to what extent did his understanding of der Abbruch des Philosophierens differ with respect to the end of philosophy he identified within skepticism in 1922 as the echter Anfang, the genuine inception? In a report on the suitability of Heidegger for the appointment of chair at the University of Berlin in 1930, it was suggested that, quote, "This is a time of crisis for Heidegger. It would be best to wait for its outcome." The time of crisis, which, as we've just established, coincides with Heidegger's renewed infatuation with the Greeks, has come to be known as die Kehre, or the turn in Heidegger's thinking. Reservoirs of ink have been spilt on the subject of Heidegger's Kehre, what it entailed, whether it even happened at all, as a certain professor having doubts, and how we might think through the relationship between early Heidegger and later Heidegger, or Heidegger I and Heidegger II. The scholarship on the question of the turn is vast, and it would be quite foolhardy to try and address the question in any comprehensive sense in the space of a 30-minute paper. Nevertheless, that is what I'm going to try to do. Put simply, I believe there is a turn in Heidegger's thinking, but I do not believe there is an early or later Heidegger, nor a Heidegger I or a Heidegger II. In my view, Heidegger's turn is a turn to the question of ground, which means a turn to the question of the unfolding of the history of being itself as an unfolding, through which Heidegger's own thinking is clarified for himself, and according to which we must interpret Heidegger's thinking itself as an unfolding. According to Tom Sheehan regarding the term, he says, the term, he says, has an overdetermined and complex history in Heidegger's work and has led to major misunderstandings of his project. Clearly, he continues, referring to GA65, the Beiträge, the turn is simply the bond between Dasein and Sein. However simple this bond is, die Kehre, as far as I can see, has rarely been discussed in terms of the question of Grund itself. In fact, it was well stated it might well be stated that the question of Grund in Heidegger's work has not yet been adequately addressed in the scholarship. Heidegger himself certainly thought so. On at least 2 occasions in the Gesamtausgabe, he bemoans the fact that his 1929 essay, Vom Wesen des Grunds, is systematically overlooked. In his lecture, Das Dasein und der Einzelne, delivered in Zurich in January 1936, Heidegger discusses his posing of the question of Dasein in his earlier writings. He says, these writings, especially the main treatise, Being and Time, date back almost 10 years. Actually, I haven't gotten any further since then. I'm still stuck on the same question. Indeed, I have returned ever more exclusively to this one question. Das ist die Frage nach dem Grund des Seins. This is the question of the ground of Sein. It simultaneously demands within itself the question of the Sein of ground, the Sein des Grunds, and the circle has already closed. Being and Time was a path and a stretch auf dem Weg zum Grund des Seins, of the way to the ground of Sein, of being with a Y. Indeed, he continues, the necessity of the question of Dasein has become even more demanding. Immediately after the publication of Being and Time, in the context of what was presumably the final reworking of what was still missing, it became clear to me that the completed approach itself had not yet been fully developed, that an even sharper stripping away of all anthropological and existential means of interpretation was necessary, The essay Von Wesen des Grunds offers a foreshadowing of this question. I consider it, he says, the most important publication. Therefore, it is probably the least read. Evidently, after Sein and Zeit, the Grundfrage, the question of ground, becomes the most important for Heidegger. In his 1938-39 work, Besinnung, this point is hammered home, and it's here that the turn is, for me, most definitively expressed. He says here, and another long quote, the endeavors of another decade show that the difficulties of mastering the question of the truth of Sein, der Frage nach der Wahrheit des Seins, because the question of being, das Sein, is intrinsically grounded in the question of Dasein and vice versa, because the intimacy, Innigkeit, of the relationship between das Sein and Dasein remains the fundamentally sustaining and besetting, and at the same time ungroundable. The question of Dasein must be posed anew and more originarily, but at the same time in explicit relation to the truth of Sein, Bezug zur Wahrheit des Seins. For this reason, he says, and he points directly to Von Wesen des Grunds here, the whole of ground had to be brought into the renewed questioning movement, and at the same time, the whole position in relation to the previous history of Western philosophy had to be clarified and intensified. Once again, the task of an overall determination, a Gesamtbesinnung, of this history from its first inception, Anaximander 1932, to Nietzsche 1937, arose. End quote. Heidegger is here pointing, of course, to his lectures on Anaximander and Parmenides from 1932 as a starting point for the possibility of bringing the whole of ground into a renewed questioning movement in order to be able to ground the Innigkeit of the relationship of das Sein and Dasein in explicit relation to the truth of Sein. Clearly for Heidegger, this turn was not as simple as we're led to believe. Clearly for Heidegger, all the way through the 1930s, this is extremely bloody difficult. We should first ask, why? Why was it in being in time? Why was it in being in time that missed, what was it, sorry, in being in time that missed the mark to such an extent that a turn was required at all? In short, it was the problem of the difference of ontological difference as a difference. That is, the problem of the difference between das Sein and das Seiende, between being and beings, if you want to offend a certain member of this reading group, or between something like presencing and what is present, if said member is your boss and you want to keep your job. The problem for Heidegger came after Sein and Zeit, and immediately after his 1927 lectures on Die Grundprobleme der Phänomenologie, when the question of the difference of ontological difference was no longer tenable. It had run out of steam, and so Heidegger turned to the more fundamental question of the unity of das Sein and das Seiende, to the question of the ground of being itself. Heidegger says as much in the Black Notebooks written between 1963 and 1970. This is volume 102 of the Gesamtausgabe. There he discusses the destruction der ontologischen Differenz. He says, if the ontological difference forms the framework of metaphysics, but metaphysics blocks the path, the way, Weg, to die Erfahrung des Ereignisses, to the experience of Ereignis, which I'll leave untranslated, and with it the experience of the destiny of being, das Sein, i.e. the presencing of what is present, hence ontological difference. Then, first and foremost, ontological difference and what was so called had to be subjected to destruction, end quote. How, Heidegger asks, could ontological difference as such be surrendered at the very beginning of the path of being and time? For this surrender, he says, insight into the time character of being qua presence, den Zeitcharakter des Seins qua Anwesenheit, is in no way sufficient. Instead, clinging to ontological difference became increasingly tenacious because the overcoming of metaphysics was envisioned as a task, and it was not yet clear that this overcoming remains a matter of the destiny of being, das Sein, ontological difference in parentheses, itself. This task, Heidegger says, sets itself into the form of thinking ontological difference as such, that is, as a difference, end quote. Only then did the regressive entanglement in metaphysics become complete. For Heidegger, what was supposed to lead out of the discussion of ontological difference actually pushed into it, into the very framework that supports it. But Heidegger here is not simply suggesting that Being and Time and other attempts in the 1920s to interrogate the difference of ontological difference resulted in failure, nor were they in any sense erroneous. Rather, he says, such attempts to transcend this framework continually pointed the way anew. As such, the Überwindung der Metaphysik, the overcoming or bringing to fruition of metaphysics, does not emerge out of an anti-metaphysical effect, but out of the necessity to think the unthought in metaphysics, and thus metaphysics itself as such. But this attempt on its way through ontological difference becomes extremely entangled in metaphysics. Thus, the Seinsfrage, the question of being itself, becomes a wrong path, a Holzwege. But, and this is the crucial bit, this wrong way, this erring, I suppose, experienced as such, contains within itself the indication for the return way, which is anything but a way out, but rather the path to freedom, which secures, gewährt, eine anfangende Bestimmung des Wegs, an inceptual determination of the way. What must be heard in this is Heidegger's claim in the 1955 colloquium on dialectic that the later metaphysics is not a decline, nicht Abfall, from Parmenides' position, but rather ihre Entfaltung, its development. If Heidegger's turn is a turn to ground through which an indication for the return way is secured, that which secures an inceptual determination of the way as he expressed it in the 1960s, where do we find concrete evidence of this turn to ground after Sein and Zeit? As I mentioned earlier, the problem of the difference of ontological difference as such became an issue for Heidegger after 1927. In his lectures on Die Grundprobleme der Phänomenologie, delivered at Marburg in the summer semester of 1927, Heidegger writes, being, Sein, and its distinction from being, I suppose, what is, von Sein dem, can only be fixed if we get to grips with the understanding from out of being as such, von Sein als solches. To grasp the understanding of being, however, first of all means to understand that being, das Sein, to whose constitution the understanding of being, Sein's Verständnis, Dasein, belongs. Heidegger acknowledges that Heidegger acknowledges in that, in order to work out the nature of the ontological difference, the relationship between das Sein and das Seiende must be worked out in the context of Dasein itself. What Heidegger struggled to name throughout the lecture series was the distinction present in the ontological difference as a difference. In resolving the difference, das Problem der Unterschiedes von Sein überhaupt und Seiende, it is this und itself that must first be addressed, first and foremost. Where am I? In 1928, Heidegger wrote the essay Vom Wesen des Grunds in conjunction with another essay, Was ist Metaphysik, both of which were published in 1929. In the foreword to the third edition of the text printed in 1949, Heidegger states that while Was ist Metaphysik concerns nothingness, das Nichts, Vom Wesen des Grunds names the ontological difference, nennt die ontologische Differenz. Here's another long quote. The nothing is the not of what is, das Nicht des Seienden, and thus being experienced, das Sein, experienced from out of what is, das vom Seienden her erfahrene Sein. The ontological difference is the not between what is and being, das Nicht zwischen Seiendem und Sein. Yet just as being, as the not to the what is by no means a nothing in the sense of a nihil negativum, so too the difference as the not between das Sein and das Seiende is in no way merely the figment of a distinction made by our understanding. That negating nichtende, not of the nothing, and this negating not of the difference are indeed not identical, yet they are the same in the sense of belonging together in the essential prevailing of the being of what is, end quote. These two texts, along with the 1930 treatise Vom Wesen der Wahrheit, which I think Yuchi will be talking about imminently, represent a turning point in Heidegger's thinking as his focus shifts from differentiating the difference of ontological difference to understanding its unity, that is, the unity of das Sein and das Seiende. In Was ist Metaphysik, Heidegger suggests that while science wants to know nothing of the nothing, the question of the nothing requires a more fundamentally existential formulation. And so he asks, Wie steht es das Nichts? How is it with nothing? How does it stand with nothing? But, he continues, by posing this question, we posit in advance the nothing of something that is, as a being, als ein Sein des. Thus, he says, asking about nothing, what and how nothing is, turns what is being questioned into its opposite. The question deprives itself of its own object. At this point in 1929, Heidegger is clearly in a transitional phase as he relates our engagement with Das Nichts in terms of die Angst, anxiety. He says plainly, anxiety reveals the nothing, die Angst offenbart das Nichts, which he elaborates shortly after by stating that through the basic attunement of anxiety, der Grundstimmung der Angst, we have arrived at that happening with Dasein in which the nothing is revealed and from out of which it is brought to question. As such, for Heidegger, Dasein means being held out into the nothing, hin Eingehaltenheit in das Nichts, which he calls transcendence. The transcendence of human Dasein signifies that it is always already beyond das Sein im Ganzen, über das Sein im Ganzen, beyond the presently present as a whole. Without, Heidegger says, the original revealedness of the nothing, there is no selfhood and no freedom. He says das Nichts is what makes it possible for what is present, der Sein denn, to be revealed as such for human Dasein, das menschliche Dasein. Das Nichts does not first provide the opposite concept to what is present, but belongs originarily to the essence of das Sein itself. In the being of what is, im Sein des Sein denn, the negating of das Nichts takes place. For Heidegger, the nothing is not an object or a being, an ein Sein des, in any sense, but the possibility of the delineation between das Sein and das Sein, ontological difference as such. In working out the unity of ontological difference in terms of das Nichts, Heidegger laid the preliminary groundwork for a renewed engagement with Parmenides, but not yet. The question of ground must be addressed first. We will recall that that Heidegger states in 1949 in the third edition of Vom Wesen des Grunds that it names the ontological difference. What does this mean? In this essay, Heidegger takes issue with the principle of sufficient reason as a supreme principle, which he says seems to preclude anything like a problem of ground. Heidegger takes the principle of sufficient reason as a point of departure for an inquiry into the question of ground itself, which he says is not determined in this principle. In the same way, the correspondence theory of truth that determines the principle of sufficient reason points to particular truths in the correlation of subject and predicate, but this precludes an understanding of the essence of truth underlying the connection. The problem of ground and the essence of truth are fundamentally connected. Truth, der Wahrheit, he says, has an essential connection to something like Grund. But then the problem of truth necessarily brings itself near the problem of ground. Therefore, the more originarily we grasp, bemächtigen, the essence of truth, the more pressing the problem of ground must become. For Heidegger, the distinctive characteristic of Dasein is that in its being understanding, Sein bestehend, it comports itself to what is. Then it is precisely this ability to distinguish, in which the ontological difference becomes factical, that must have the root of its own possibility in the ground of the essence of Dasein. Heidegger thus calls the ground of ontological difference the transcendence of Dasein. If, Heidegger continues, one characterizes all comportment toward what is, Verhalten zu sein denn, as intentional, then intentionality is possible only on the ground of transcendence. Here, the crucial step beyond Husserl is taken in an essay written for Husserl's 70th birthday festschrift, no less. For Heidegger, the question of the essence of ground becomes the problem of transcendence. Heidegger conceives of transcendence pertaining to human Dasein as being in the world, in der Welt sein, which does not simply mean that human Dasein is one being amongst others, that it belongs alongside what is. Rather, to transcendence belongs to world, Welt, as that whereupon surpassing happens, der Überstieg geschieht. In clarifying Welt, Heidegger appeals to the ancient Greek conception of cosmos, which does not refer to this or that individual being or entity, nor does it refer to the totality of beings or entities taken together. Rather, he says, cosmos should be translated as Zustand, the how in which what is as a whole is, das Wie in dem das Seiende und zwar im Ganzen ist. Cosmos Utos, therefore, does not designate this domain of being in contrast to another, but rather this world of being in contrast to another world of the same being, the aeon itself, katacosmon. What begins to emerge in the text now is the working out of the difference of ontological difference as a unity, but not as a what, but as a how, a wie. If there is a Kira in Heidegger's thinking, then it is in these pages that it occurs. When Heidegger refers back to von Wesen des Grunds as his most important and therefore least understood text, then it is to the following passage that he has specifically in mind. He says, several things are already apparent from these brief indications. One, Welt, world, means rather a how of the being of what is as this how itself. Two, this how determines what is as a whole. In its ground, it is the very possibility of every how in general as limit and measure. Three, this how as a whole, wie im Ganzen, is in a certain way prior, vorgängisch. Four, this prior how as a whole is itself relative to human Dasein, relative auf das menschliche Dasein. The world therefore belongs, gehört, precisely to human Dasein, although it encompasses everything that is, including Dasein, end quote. This passage indicates, in my view, nothing less than Heidegger working out the fundamental relationship between das Sein, das Seiende, and Dasein in terms of the how, the wie. This wie, this how, and so this Welt, world, is das Sein itself in its earliest form of Heidegger's thinking. Why then, in the Besinnung text of 1938-39, GA66, does Heidegger seemingly lament what he calls another decade of mastering der Frage nach der Wahrheit des Seins, the question of the truth of Sein? If das Sein, is, as I've suggested, worked out as early as 1929. The following passage in that text in GA66 clues us in. He says, in the unity, der Einheit, this historical and fundamental reflection on the Grundfrage, the question of ground, the transitional position of the entire questioning also became clear. The difficulty grew to make this questioning apparent as a truly necessary historical necessity, end quote. The difficulty for Heidegger then was not working out the unity of das Sein and das Seiende as das Sein, as Welt, world, or wie, how. If anything, by comparison, that was the easy part. But then how do you bring that into a questioning movement, a Fragebewegung? And we must hear the Weg in here as well as the Frage, because to be on the way of questioning is the essence of Dasein itself. We will recall only a month or so ago Heidegger's remarks in section 19 of the Hölderlin lectures, J39, concerning the difference between explanation, erklären, and understanding, verstehen, where he argues that explanation is Unwesen, the unessence of understanding. To explain something, he says, means to bring it back to something that is clear to us, that is, in this context, to whatever is handy and manageable. All explanation is always the escape into what is commonplace for us, that wherein we appease ourselves on a daily basis, that which we immediately have at our disposal at all times, that with which we are already familiar, where something is explained, there is nothing more to understand. On the other hand, understanding is authentically, regarded in its originary essence, knowledge of the unexplainable, because it lets what is unexplainable stand as such. Understanding a mystery, ein Rätsel, does not mean solving the mystery, but the converse. It means releasing the mystery as that concerning which and with regard to which we have no known counsel in the sense of our everyday calculative means of disposal. The more originarily we understand, the further that which is unexplained and inexplicable extends and becomes unveiled as such. End quote. This is why the Seinsfrage, the question of being, could never be answered by means of definition, as if Heidegger was looking down the barrel of a firing squad and asked to say what he really means by the word being, and he said simply presence. This wouldn't be in the slightest bit helpful. This is why a dictionary of Heidegger's terms could never be definitive enough or even close. Not because Heidegger changed his mind throughout his writings about what certain words meant or how certain ideas were expressed. There is no fluidity in the meaning of Heidegger's works, only a historicality, because Heidegger works are a path of thinking, a way of questioning, upon which Heidegger never stopped travelling. This is precisely why Heidegger undertook the question of the history of being from Anaximander to Nietzsche from 1932 onwards, not to show a deterioration of Western thought as metaphysics, nor to show how this alleged deterioration was passed down from thinker to thinker, from Parmenides to Plato to Aristotle to Descartes to Kant to Hegel to Nietzsche, like some kind of narrative of a history of ideas, but to understand how each thinker thought upon the address of the unfolding of being itself. What unfolds in this unfolding is the ground of the history of being. For Heidegger, the Anfang, the inception of the history of being, is not a beginning in the sense of an onset of something which is then left behind, but an Ursprung, an origin. The Anfang comes to the fore in the course of the history of being and is fully there only at its end. We'll recall only a few weeks ago in one of the final sections of GA39, Heidegger says, "The hour of our history has struck. We must first take what has been given us as endowment into pure safekeeping, once again, yet only so as to comprehend and take hold of what has been given us as our task. That is, to question ourselves before and through it. Die Gewalt des Seins, the violence of Sein, must first and actually become a question again for our ability to grasp." For Heidegger, the violence of das Sein is both a suffering and a destiny. This suffering, in which Sein becomes manifest as destiny, is not, however, a mere capability to simply receive, as it were, a destiny that lies before it. Rather, this suffering is creative. It discloses and unfolds the need. Only in such suffering can a destiny take hold of us, a destiny that never simply lies present before us, but that is ascending, that is sent to us, and in such a way that it sends toward our Bestimmung, our determination, granted that we ourselves truly send ourselves into it and know of what is fittingly sent, and in knowing it, will it. Earlier in this paper, I quoted Heidegger's remark that his previous insights into the time character of being as present was in no way sufficient. It becomes sufficient only through this questioning of das Sein. So we must not then ask what das Sein is, but how das Sein is it, or as in 1929, how Welt weltet, how world worlds. Surely then, das Sein ist Zeit, is time itself, that which has been and that which is to come, specifically that which is to come anfänglicher, inceptually. We ask the question then, wie ist das Sein? How is das Sein? And we answer, das Sein ist, as time, Ereignis. As Zeit, it is itself groundless, because it is the essential Abgrund of the in-betweeners of Ereignen, of happening. We will again recall the lectures of Hölderlin and on Hölderlin and Heidegger's treatment of the famous letters to Bullendorf, in which Hölderlin, in his assessment of the relationship between the Germans and the Greeks, maintains that one's own, das eigene, must be learned as well as das Fremde, the foreign. This is why, he says, the Greeks are indispensable to us, only we shall not come close to them precisely in what is our own, unsem eigenen, our national, because, as mentioned, der freie Gebrauch des eigenen, the free use of one's own is what is most difficult. In his own assessment of Hölderlin's letters, Heidegger suggests that our highest achievement will come about for us if we set to work the endowment of being able to grasp in such a way that this grasping binds and determines itself and enjoins itself to the jointure of das Sein. If our ability to grasp does not become perverted into an end in itself. Surely then das eigene, one's own, is that which has been given to us as endowment in order to comprehend and take hold of what has been given to us as our task. That is, to question ourselves before and through it. Surely this is das Ereignis itself. To conclude then, because I'm wildly past time, I think, for Heidegger, the necessity of posing the question of Dasein anew and more originarily, and at the same time in explicit relation to the truth of Sein, Bezug zur Wahrheit des Seins, emerged by bringing the whole of ground into a renewed questioning movement, only through which could ontological difference itself be overcome. But of course, it was only through this initial engagement with ontological difference as such that the possibility of the question of ground emerged at all. By attending to the question of ground as the unfolding of the history of being as metaphysics from Anaximander to Nietzsche in terms of its Anfang, its inception, which, as I said earlier, is not merely a beginning, but comes to the fore in the course of the history of being and is fully there only at its end. This unfolding is in no way a deterioration of thinking from Parmenides' initial position, but its necessary development. If now we understand ground as the unfolding of what unfolds in the history of being, it is only through the questioning of ground, the questioning of how thinking itself unfolds, that the possibility of the destruction of ontologischen difference can be realized, and the way, die Weg, the path to the experience of Ereignis, and with it, the experience of the destiny of being, is opened up. At the beginning of his 1934-35 lectures on Hölderlin, we will recall Heidegger asks the fundamental question, wer sind wir? Who are we? Through Hölderlin, Heidegger means here not simply to provide, that is, explain the answer, but to secure the means, the way upon which this questioning movement can be brought to emergence for itself. Heidegger's turn to ground then was not simply a solution to show the what of the unity of ontological difference, but it's how, it's wie, a means of opening up the question of the truth of Sein as Schicksal, as destiny, as the fundamental questioning of human Dasein, the way to the experience of Ereignis. Why? Because in Hölderlin's words, we learn nothing with greater difficulty than the free use of the national, that is, das eigene. Thank you. Sorry, Lawrence, I went massively over.
I'm not gonna. Am I being heard?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not gonna say anything about people who go over time, except that for once I didn't and you did.